There were also concerns about whether or not trying to do procedures like this, in addition to mutilating the donor's body by scarring it, did they violate the ethical obligation to try and take care of yourself? And that related to another question: could you risk someone's life to save someone else's? It wasn't really clear what the impact would be on donors. There had been some animal studies, there were dog studies, but in all honesty, there weren't long-term follow-ups, and besides that, whenever you get to humans, you're still not sure exactly what's going to happen. So the notion of harming someone to save another was ethically controversial. So even though many years later, Murray won the Nobel Prize for this first transplant, it turns out that organ transplantation in its modern form of kidneys and livers and hearts and lungs and pancreas and so on was given birth to under very controversial circumstances. The way those controversies were handled has set the tone for everything that goes on today in transplant. And even those of you who might either get an organ or someday be an organ donor, either living or dead, because a particular ethical framework emerged. In order to protect living people, the idea was that you had to make an extraordinary effort to both assess their competency and their informed consent. So one protection that was built in to handle the concern about coercion was to make sure that people really were choosing to do this. And that might even mean doing something which delights me. I'm not sure it will delight everybody in the room, but early on, decisions had to be made that you would be willing to lie about a prospective donor. This is one of the few places where lying becomes perhaps an ethically acceptable thing to do. If I don't want to give an organ to my brother, but I choose not to be excluded from the family for it, then maybe the transplant team has to say, you're not medically suitable to be a donor, and I get off the hook. So it takes away the coercion factor by saying, we're going to make it possible for you to say no, if you really want to say no, without being humiliated or embarrassed or feeling that you just can't do it. To this day, most living donor programs will operate with that ethos, that they will provide a medical disqualification. Some don't think of it as lying, by the way, because they also say, well, if you're psychologically unwilling, then you're medically disqualified. But I think that's stretching the notion of medically disqualified. I think we're basically telling a lie to protect the welfare of the donor. I prefer to think of it more in the category of, do I look fat in this dress? That's what we call in bioethics reasoning out by analogy. Anyway, the principle also was put in place that you should not allow people to sell their organs. And there's been a lot of discussion lately, I'm going to say more about this in a little bit, about whether we should get organs by paying people for them. But in order to make it acceptable to, if you will, harm yourself, the notion of harming yourself for money seemed unacceptable. The notion of harming yourself to make a gift to someone else seemed morally more acceptable. And so the idea that organ donation should be altruistic comes not out of the blue or not because people just thought that was a nice thing to do. It was a response to the concern that if people were going to choose to put themselves at risk and actually harm their bodies, it might be acceptable to do so if they were making a wonderful gift to save somebody else's life. But if you just said, I'm going to do this because someone's going to give me cash, that seemed to constitute a kind of harm to yourself and a harm to the body that was ethically unacceptable. So that's where the notion of altruistic informed consent comes from. And even the idea of risking your life for money to help another versus deciding to do it out of free choice and because you altruistically want to help, that framework is the framework that we have today. Voluntary, altruistic, informed consent. That's a very special moral framework. It's been in place for 50 years. Interestingly, it was created to handle living donors, but it extended over the years into the realm of cadaver donors as well. So I mentioned when this all got going, you had to be alive, you had to be biologically identical, and as you all know, we now today get a fair number of organs from people who have died as well as people who are living. To take organs from cadavers, you have to find ways to find out what their blood type is, and as people in medicine learned, know what their immune differences are. Then you need drugs that can minimize those differences so that organs won't be rejected, the so-called immunosuppressants. And they were probably the biggest breakthrough in transplant. Drugs like the steroids and later cyclosporin and other more powerful drugs have come along that have allowed people to, if you will, do mismatches between donors and recipients who aren't genetically identical. Now, it's still the case for most organs. The closer you are biologically, the better the chance for success. But in recent years, amazing things have been done in perfecting immunosuppression to allow transplantation to be done between strangers, both living and dead. So that technology changed. Another technology change was learning how to preserve organs, something called Wisconsin solution, which I am horrified to state that I'm so old that I remember when it came online. Finding out how you could perfuse an organ so that you could put it in one of those coolers that we all see people running around with, to jets. That was a major technological breakthrough. Now, the organs do get somewhat damaged by the process of transport, perfusion, and cooling, but not so badly that they won't function, and they're pretty resilient organs, some more than others. Heart's a little trickier, kidney's pretty tough. So it turned out then you could move organs from where the donor was elsewhere. And one other problem arose, and this is where sort of one of the roots of bioethics came from. If you had a person who was dead and they had no breathing and no circulation, the organs inside their bodies would not last very long, would not be suitable for transplant. Machines were showing up in the 60s, the ventilator, the heart and lung machine, that might allow you to keep somebody going even if they had suffered such bad injuries, particularly to their head and brain, that they were certainly dead. But the machine might be able to supplant the function. And so the dilemma, it was a dilemma when I first got into this, when Eric was reading my newsletters that I was writing from nursery school. How do you know when someone's dead, and would it be ethical to take organs from someone who's still on life support? And that led to quite a little battle. A lot of discussion took place about whether death could only be pronounced when your heart and lungs had stopped. Other people said, well, maybe you're dead when you're in a permanent vegetative state, the Terry Schiavo situation. Other people said maybe you have to have no brain function whatsoever. For those of you trying to sort these states out, I know it's confusing. I often, when I'm getting my latest updates on medical information at the checkout counter at Gennardi's, I will examine the tabloids that are there. And there's two headlines that have been dominating the tabloids in the past couple of years. One is Bat Boy, who is a horrific genetic chimera creature who's been killed and come back to life many times. He's the subject of a different lecture. And genetic engineering run amok. And Coma Cop wakes up. It would seem as if all over the United States, about once a month, somebody who's a policeman for some reason gets in a coma and wakes up after usually a prolonged period of not being conscious. And the tabloid papers make much of this and are very excited about it, proving that the dead can awake, basically.